Mysteries, Archive Record 317-E. Today's word is the elements are brutal and unforgiving. The year is 1959. Deep in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, a group of experienced hikers embark on a challenging expedition that will cement their names in history forever. But what begins as an adventure for 10 young college students quickly turns into a grim tale of horror. The Dyatlov Pass, a remote and treacherous region of Siberia, becomes the destination for this unsettling tale. Posthumously named for the expedition's leader, Igor Dyatlov, this area is known for its harsh conditions and eerie stillness. Attributes that have only been malignantly reinforced since the unfortunate events that we'll be discussing. The expedition began on January 27, 1959. The plan was to ski from Vizhai, one of Russia's northern settlements, to the remote Otorten Mountain, a 50-mile hike through the Siberian wilderness. By doing so, the participants would graduate from Class 2 hikers to Class 3, the highest level of Russian hiking classification at the time. 10 hikers set out on the trip, consisting of 8 men and 2 women. They were all experienced and well-traveled, but only a single day in, one of them had to turn back. Yuri Yudin, a young and otherwise healthy man, suffered from rheumatism that occasionally caused him a great amount of joint pain. In most situations, this was a limitation for Yuri, but this time, it would spare him from a gruesome fate. The remaining men and women ventured deeper into the wilderness, unaware that the trail they blazed only led to their deaths. Despite being a man down already, Igor and his party were all motivated and well prepared for the harsh conditions ahead. But on February 1st, only 6 days into the journey, something went terribly wrong. The group had been making good time, and were over halfway to their destination. They had been trekking primarily across valleys and lowlands, but now the time had come to climb. Only mountains, crevices, and danger were ahead. This was where the challenge was, where the adventure became an expedition, where death waited for them. Foot by foot, meter by meter, they gained elevation, but visibility worsened. A snowstorm began beating down on them, conjuring cutting winds and blinding snow to stop their progression. With nature fighting against them, they were forced to make an unplanned course deviation. Rather than continuing north, the group made a hard turn to the west. Likely hoping to avoid losing altitude, they set up camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakal, known to the indigenous Mansi people as the Mountain of the Dead. The tent was pitched and the camp was set. When twilight arrived, everyone laid down to get some much-needed rest before regaining their bearings in the morning. But that night, in the pitch black, something happened. Some unknown catastrophic event took place that forced a primal panic, something that made it more appealing to run into the endless darkness of the Mountain of the Dead than stay and face it. Instincts took over, and instincts said to run. What chills to the bone more than Siberian winter? When the group failed to return on February 20th, the first search party was sent out after them. Over the next 6 days, dozens of students, teachers, military personnel, police, and even prison guards assisted with the search. Barely anything was visible from a helicopter, which meant that if they were going to find the group, it would need to be done on foot. The search was made especially difficult because Igor only provided broad details on the journey to his university before embarking. This left the search party to fill in the gaps themselves using only the known destination and start location. Beginning at the end, they first examined Mount Otorten. No flags, camping supplies, or evidence to be found, leaving them to surmise that the hikers never made it to their destination. Now, they needed to work backward and scour for any signs of travel. It took 5 days of countless hours of planning and searching before anything turned up. Eventually, though, faint ski tracks were finally found, barely still visible from the snowstorms, but obvious enough to follow. Using the trajectory of the tracks, it took another full day of hiking, but the search party finally found the camp. What they discovered was bewildering. No bodies in sight, but instead was a half-buried tent, which had been ripped open from the inside. Despite looking carefully, the surroundings offered no hint to the group's location other than scattered clothing that littered the mountainside. Investigators began combing the area, carefully examining the snow for any signs. A day later, they came across a point of interest, a large cedar tree with a flat spot in the ground. They had stumbled upon Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. The men were found 1.5 kilometers away from the camp, frozen to death and lying on the ground next to each other. Their appendages had blackened and their flesh turned purple by the frost. They were barely clothed and had no shoes on. The individuals possessed several wounds across their bodies, with torn skin on their hands, faces, and legs, along with various patches of frostbite and bruises. A fire had been lit under the tree at some point, using branches from the surrounding area for fuel. Strangely though, the branches had been cut with a knife, and neither of the two had one in their possession. Investigators concluded that the others were likely here before venturing off. Based on the state of their clothing and location of injuries, it's also likely that the others cut clothing off of them after their deaths. Likely cause of death? Hypothermia. Rustam Slobodin, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Igor Dyatlov were discovered the same day, 300 meters from the tree and toward the camp. Igor was the first to be found, nearly completely covered in snow, with only his clenched fists visible above the surface. His body was posed in a manner that suggests he was closing his jacket, which was strangely unbuttoned. While much better insulated than his previous counterparts, Igor was also oddly not wearing shoes. He had very minor injuries across his body, but strangely had bruises and swelling on his knuckles, which has led some investigators to believe he was involved in a fist fight prior to his death. Likely cause of death? Hypothermia. Zenaida Kolmogorova was the next to be found. She was much better dressed than the others, having several layers across her body. Multiple items of clothing were torn, however, suggesting that they had been taken from others or scavenged from corpses, but yet again, no shoes. Her autopsy also showed bruising and cuts across her body. Strangely, there was a distinct bruise on her abdomen, speculated to have been left by a baton of some kind. Likely cause of death? Hypothermia due to violent accident. Rustam Slobodin was found close to Zenaida on March 5th. He was completely buried in snow, lying face down. He was wearing 2 pairs of pants, a sweater, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt boot. Investigators also found a small pocket knife in his possession, along with other miscellaneous items. Could this be the one used to cut the tree branches near the first bodies? Strangely, Rustam's autopsy showed a large skull fracture. External medical examiners ascertained his death was the result of direct blunt force trauma. Evidence derived from the ice formation beneath his body suggests that Rustam likely fell to the ground before freezing. Officially, Soviet physicians determined his cause of death to be hypothermia. Likely cause of death? Unknown. The remaining 4 were not found until several months later. A native Mansi man was traveling with his dog when he noticed a path formed by cut branches. He walked for 50 meters before finding several articles of clothing strewn about, some with missing sleeves or legs. While the area had been previously searched, nothing was found. But with new evidence, investigators thought to dig deeper. An area 4 meters beneath the surface was dug out before finding a makeshift survival shelter. This area would come to be known as the Den. Built inside a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree, it followed typical conventions that Soviet troops used on the front lines of World War II during winter. Branches were laid on the ground to minimize contact, and the location was optimal for slowing winds. So then why did they fail to survive? Strangely, the hikers were not found within the shelter itself, but rather a few feet from it in a small area, as if placed there. 2 of the bodies were even found to have radiation present on their clothing, and while some radioactive materials were still in use for nighttime lighting on instruments, there were none present on the expedition. Even more perplexing, several members had extreme bone injuries determined to have taken place prior to death. Dubinina and Thibault-Brenol both had major chest fractures along their rib cages. Curiously, it was as if they had both experienced the same injury at different points in time. Dubinina's body was also strangely missing its tongue and both eyes. While this could usually be attributed to wild animals, it's extremely unlikely that one could have reached her considering she had been buried for so long. No explanation was formally given by medical professionals as to how this could have happened. Cause of death? Unknown. Zolotaryov was also found with no eyes and a large, severe head injury that left his skull exposed. He was perhaps the most properly clothed yet, with several layers protecting him, making it clear that he probably didn't die from hypothermia. One thing that sticks out with Zolotaryov is that he had a camera in his possession, one that hadn't been documented by anyone else on the trip, in addition to another that he had brought along. Very strange. Unfortunately, the film had been damaged by melting water, but as expert Teodora Hadjiska puts it, what was so important that he captured on the slope of the mountain that day? According to witnesses that were on site during the exhumation, he was also holding a pen and a notepad in one hand, with Red Army Colonel Ortyukov being the only one to have seen the contents, ultimately reporting it as completely empty and being subsequently lost from evidence. Likely cause of death? Unknown. Kolevatov had an open wound behind his right ear, a seemingly broken nose, and a deformed neck. These would seemingly be the result of an attack, not uncommon to one seen by special forces, but autopsy reports were suspiciously vague on the cause of death and injuries. Similar to Zolotaryov, however, Kolevatov was well dressed for the weather, and would have been sufficiently warm within the den. Therefore, it is also unlikely that he died from hypothermia. Likely cause of death? Unknown. Thibault-Brenol was found with numerous fractures in his skull in a circular pattern, as if something like a rock impacted the side of his head, potentially from a large fall when climbing or hiking. Similar to Zolotaryov, he was extremely well dressed for the weather, and with both men being so prepared, some have suggested that they may have been outside of the group's tent when the mysterious event took place. What could have caused such specific injuries, and where did the radiation come from? Speculation ran rampant. Was it an avalanche, a military test gone wrong, or something more sinister? Despite numerous investigations, no definitive explanation has been released by Soviet officials. Here's a concise overview of the main theories we consider plausible. Avalanche. The most widely accepted theory is that an avalanche forced the hikers to flee their tent. This could explain the blunt force injuries that several individuals sustained, but Kholat Syakhl is not an avalanche-prone area, and is not particularly steep. However, if the tent was covered even by a small avalanche, it would create a panic. This may be why the tent was cut open from the interior. In contrast, their ski gear was found placed vertically near the campsite, as if undisturbed. This would imply that the area was spared a sudden rush of snow. Deemed plausible, but unlikely. Yeti. Some believe the hikers encountered a Yeti or other cryptid based on fabricated reports of strange footprints and noises. Some individuals have also correlated Dubinina's missing tongue to a Yeti ripping it out, but there is no evidence for this. Deemed unlikely due to known Yeti migration patterns in the region and unsubstantiated claims. Methanol poisoning. The results of extensive methanol exposure are proven to lead to reduced consciousness, cognitive abilities, vomiting, abdominal pain, and decreased vision, eventually leading to blindness and kidney failure. This would track with the strange behavior exhibited by the hikers and the odd choices that they made leading up to their deaths. Hikers often carry alcohol with them for medicinal purposes or to light fires, but the stove inside the group's tent was found to have only burned dry fuel. While a flask was found in their possession, investigators were unable to identify what type of alcohol was contained within, and it was unlikely to be pure methanol. Deemed unlikely. Military testing of radiosondes. As stated by Vladimir Nagaev, a distinguished KGB operative, Federal Security Service of Russia agent, and head of the Russian Military Medical Institute, the Dyatlov group died while participating in a scientific experiment of national importance. They were launching special-purpose radio probes in an unpopulated area. Under the chloroprene shell of the balloon was a gas with short-lived radioactive isotopes, 5-sulfur phosphorus. Meteorological rockets are known to have been used in the region of Mount Otorten. At some point, a missile must have hit one or more radiosondes and spilled the radioactive content. These chemicals are highly toxic, radioactive, and will be completely undetectable in the body within 5 minutes. Direct exposure is likely to cause pulmonary edema, expansion of the right atrium and ventricle of the heart, as well as swelling of organs and dark blood. Considering that the group had not been found until a month after their disappearance, which was deliberately delayed, this means that any trace of these chemicals would have been gone by the time of arrival. The effects of 5-sulfur phosphorus exposure also line up nearly perfectly with the strange autopsy results, especially the dark brown blood found in several hikers. Deemed likely. As the icy winds of the Ural Mountains grow silent and the snow settles once more, we are left with a tapestry of theory and mystery surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident. From the frigid bite of a potential avalanche to the shadowy corners of military experiments and the chilling whispers of the supernatural. In the end, the Dyatlov Pass incident serves as a stark reminder of the limits of human understanding when confronted with the unknown. Whether driven by natural forces, secretive intentions, or otherworldly encounters, the events of February 1959 continue to defy definitive explanation. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of the Bureau of Mysteries. Until next time, remember, not all mysteries are meant to be solved, yet still, we continue to explore all possibilities.